Welcome to the Dealing with Goliath podcast. The mission of Dealing with Goliath is to sharpen the psychological edge in negotiation and high-impact conversations for business leaders with skin in the game who want to be more effective under pressure, uncover hidden value, and increase profitability. With expert guests across the business spectrum, we deliver gems of wisdom, delving into their methods, their thinking and approach to business, life, and to problem solving. This is the Grande Cup of Insight, long-form podcast interview, where we take the time to delve a little bit deeper into our guests' experiences, stories, and to get those priceless nuggets. I'm your host, Al McBride, and my guest today is Simon Haigh. Simon is known as the Growth Strategist. He's coach, consultant, author, and speaker. So let's break that down just for a moment now. So he's a 5-star author of 3 books: Contract Law in an E-commerce Age, How to Be a Better Dealcloser, and Dealmaking for Corporate Growth, the latter 2 of which were foreworded by Marshall Goldsmith. He's a former lawyer in the UK, Ireland, and Australia, a successful entrepreneur who built and sold out of tech, luxury goods, and travel, and a global CEO and C-suite executive on 4 continents for over 28 years. Now, to add to all that, he's also sat on the boards of over 5 boards and currently advisor to 3 in the US, Ireland, and has featured on the BBC. He's a globally recognized expert in negotiation, deals, business, leadership, mindset, and brand growth. And that's the abridged version. So Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That is the abridged version, but yeah, there's a lot there. I've done a lot of things. Some of it has been planned. A lot of it hasn't been planned.
Well, that's part of what we're going to dive into today. So can you say what some of the key threads are through all of these different activities in different places in the world? What are some of those themes looking back to what brought you to the present moment?
Well, that's a good question. There's lots of different threads and themes, but I think overall, I've spent 28 years living in 5 countries, working through various different industries, originally as a lawyer, then did an MBA and became a CEO, and then the last nearly 10 years running my own coaching consulting business, but also investing in businesses. And I guess the overriding core theme is what I've noticed in organizations is that they need to grow, a bit like humans spiritually. If we don't grow, we go backwards. So organizations need to grow to go forwards. If they're not growing, they're effectively going backwards. They're stagnating and somebody else is going to overtake them. And B, growth, while there is a quantitative aspect to it and a financial aspect and a measurement aspect to it, is predominantly about human beings and how they communicate and interact. So I guess I'm referred to as the growth strategist. So I like to look at organizations through the prism of 4 pieces of jigsaw, if it were fitting together. Mm-hmm. Business growth. So what are the business growth processes and practices that need to be put in place? Leadership growth. What are the key things that leaders need to do to fit into business growth? Brand growth. So how does this impact your brand? And then finally, tying it all together, the mindset. The growth mindset of the individuals running the business. So there's the 4 aspects. So I guess that's the core theme, is that people and businesses need to grow. And I've been fascinated by what it is that organizations and people need to optimize that growth. That's the short answer.
That's the short answer. And out of that, what do you love about your work? What really makes a day extra special, or a week that little bit better, or even just that you don't have to be asked to do a lot of this stuff anymore. You really have a choice of where you put your focus and your time and your energy. So where's the joy in it for you?
The first word that comes into my head when you ask that is variety. I love the variety. So, for example, on any given day, I would be like tomorrow, I'm doing 2 training programs online, one with ISME for small, medium businesses, co-hosting a 12-week program on growth. I'm also working with a hotel chain on inclusive and cohesive growth and how the individuals in leadership in the organization can work together to align and drive cohesive, inclusive growth. I'm also writing stuff. I'm now becoming an ambassador for a tech company over here. I advise about 3 businesses. So I love the variety. That's the first answer. The second part of it is what I really, really enjoy doing is when I'm working, coaching or mentoring or training is seeing the light bulbs going off, right? So helping people match their confidence, and I keep saying this, they're matching their confidence, shining a light on matching people's confidence with their capabilities. We all have capability levels, right? And what fascinates me is how I can, what is it about the individual or the organization that can I shine a light on to make them realize, this is easier than we thought. So matching that confidence with the capability to enable them to then do it and move forward. So variety and seeing that light bulb moment.
Very good, very good. It's something I heard from a colleague recently that in a fairly substantial poll of executives and C-suite people that confidence as an issue came up far more than everybody thought. I mean, does that surprise me a little bit? Not hugely, but a little bit. Is that thought surprising to you, or does that fit with your experience?
No, it doesn't really surprise me. I guess for me, confidence is kind of the outer manifestation with communication of what's inside, which is around awareness, right? And I think unless you know everything, right? Unless you know that, right? You're always looking over your shoulder, thinking, "Is there more that I need to know?" And I think so. That awareness, that self-awareness, but also that situational awareness. Where do I fit in an organization? I think that's a major issue. And, I think self and situational awareness, self-management, which is, so you have, self-awareness and self-management, and then you have situational awareness and relationship management. They're both dovetail either side of the spectrum for individuals and groups. I think they're areas that more and more businesses really need to look at demystifying this stuff, right? There's no rocket science to this stuff. It's about communication and connection, as we are doing here, right? Yeah. And so I think the confidence or the perceived or actual lack of confidence comes out of organizations are not breaking this down sufficiently to make this as simple as possible. It's not easy, but to make this as simple as possible from a training or coaching or mentoring perspective. I think that's a big part of it.
I think you're right. It's, as you were saying that, I could nearly hear some people sort of go, "Oh, not more training. How much more training do we need?" But as you said, it's not the dumbing down. It's, as you said, the simplification down to what is it in its essence, rather than making it more complicated than it need be.
Yeah. And that's what I love doing. I mean, I guess if you were to ask me, Al, what would be my life purpose? I've only just figured out at the age of 53, my professional life purpose is to learn as much as I can about the 4 different aspects of growth, and then try and distill them and simplify them and pass the message on. So, for example, I do a lot of training around influencing, or say assertiveness, right? And so nobody ever taught me what assertiveness is. And you can just assume it's a whole muddle of complicated stuff, right? And then not bother with it, because human beings don't really engage unless they can see a clear path through. So I train and I say, right, assertiveness is about, asking for what you want, feel, or desire, number 1. Number 2, in a way that's respectful of others. That's straightforward and simple, and people remember the 1 and 2, right?
Yeah.
And then I say, there's a difference between assertiveness in the middle and aggressiveness on the right and passiveness on the left. You want to aim for the middle. So that's what I love doing, is just demystifying these things that people perceive to be hugely complicated. And then obviously you need to build a process around that, but you start with that simple premise. And, it's a bit like anchoring. People remember the simple premise first, and then I think they feel more empowered and triggered then to connect with what you're saying.
Absolutely. It's that Bill Gates idea of you start with a simple system, and then it can get more complicated as it needs to, but you shouldn't start with a complex system. No. Absolutely. It's a very good point. It's that approach is something that you bring to your negotiation strategy or approach, isn't it? I mean, you've written at least 2-3 books now on at least directly regarding negotiation and deal making. And first of all, why do you focus on the deal making, as in it's often seen as the last part? number one. And I suppose the other question is what is your take on that? How do you differentiate your thinking on it?
Okay, so the first thing to say is there's nothing majorly different between when you use the term deal making or deal closing or deals. People think that's very highfalutin and it's very Donald Trump, and it doesn't apply to me. And it's really just about sales, right? It's really all just about sales and negotiation. I've written 2 books around deals. I wrote a book on contract law in the past, but the first book was called Dealmaking for Corporate Growth, right? And so when I talk about deal making, I'm actually talking about the whole process, the whole ecosystem that a corporate needs to have to be good at deal making. So does it have the right people? Does it have the right processes? So I'm looking at the culture, the organizational setup landscape to enable that organization to be good at closing, at deal making, right? Which means identifying deals, having the right people on the deal making team, closing deals, doing the stuff afterwards. And then the recent book is How to Be a Better Deal Closer, which takes it to the next stage. So the first book was about an organizational ecosystem. How does a company become good at business development, right? Mm-hmm. And the recent book is, having put that ecosystem in place, what systems and processes do they need then to really be able to close deals efficiently, right? So there's the deal-making environment, and then there's methodologies for closing. Having said all this, there's not really much difference between the sales process and the deal process. The reason I talk about deals is that I'm talking about more complicated transactions, not just going to a shop to buy something, and not all sales are deals, and not all deals are sales. Brexit would be a good example of a very big deal, right? So the deal making part was, who was on the EU negotiating team? What systems did they have? What research did they do about the British negotiation team? How much planning did they do? What was the power equation? All those factors. So, and in both books, I created what, again, because I like to simplify things, I created what I call the 7P methodology. And that literally, Al, came out. I never actually planned that. When I was asked to write the first book 5 years ago, initially I was just going to pour my memories of all the deals that I was involved with. And then as I was writing it, a logical process unfolded. So the first P is principles. Before you go into doing deals, do you have the right culture? Do you have the right value set? Do you have the right people on board, right? Then the second P is, so that was principles, then planning. Do you have the right processes to enable planning and business development and tenders? Then power, right? Do you have the right power structure in your organization? When you in a deal scenario, do you have the right power equation between individuals? Players is the fourth one. Then it's performance, which is the actual deal. Then putting it all to bed. So, the boring stuff, actually signing the contract and heads of agreement, all that stuff, but very important. And then finally, what I call payout or post-mortem. So you've either done the deal or you haven't, but in either case, you need to have a process to do continuous improvement. So that 7-step literally just came out. I was writing it down, and it's probably been the best thing I ever came up with, because it created the 2 books and then the association with Marshall, etc. So I just like to break things down.
It's excellent. Yeah. I mean, I've read it. It's a very, very good book. It's one thing I would like to ask you on that is, having done a lot of very successful deals in all sorts of different industries and countries, what do you find with maybe less experienced deal makers or less successful negotiators? What are some of those key mistakes that they tend to make?
One key mistake is not leveraging a simple thing well enough, which is using silence strategically. And
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so and there's a saying, I do quite a bit of work with Dermot Mannion, the former CEO of Aer Lingus, around negotiation training. And there's this saying, loose lips sink ships. And if you don't need to say something in a negotiation, don't say it, right? Don't say it. And also, and this applies to me because I'm a natural people pleaser. I like to be liked. So if I ask a question and I don't hear a response, my immediate gut feeling impulse is to say, well, I meant this, to try and help them along. Don't try and resist that. Just allow that silence to form. Because in hindsight, when I have the opportunity to review, scenarios I've been in, I've looked back and I've thought to myself, if only I'd listened to the silences and things that hadn't been said. And, I had a gut feeling that person wasn't happy and they didn't say anything, but I didn't allow them to be silent, right? I just kept talking. So I think silence is important. I guess another one then is influencing. I've kind of nearly mentioned influencing before. To be a good deal maker, negotiator, you need to have an awareness of what influencing is, right? And influencing is not persuasion. Persuasion has negative undertones, right? Mm-hmm. Influencing for me is there's something about you, there's an honesty and an enthusiasm and a likability about you, a form of a feeling of gut feeling trust that brings others with you. And, there are 7 different types of influence, which I won't talk about now, but I think having a knowledge and appreciation of leveraging influencing skills is something that we could all do with. Nobody taught me. I don't know about you, Al, but I think they will be the 2, using silence and having an awareness and using influencing skills.
It's very interesting you mentioned it in a very ethical way, that you have an awareness of the gentle, almost honest, for want of a better word, effect that one has on others, and vice versa, of how you're also influenced by people around you, by people you admire or have respect for. Absolutely. Yeah. The silence is a very interesting one. I noticed that way back when I was an art dealer, that I used to close so many deals by just saying my piece, having the conversation, removing as many blockers as possible in the client's mind, and then just shutting the hell up. And more often than not, the next thing they'd say, it could be 30 seconds, it could be 2 minutes of silence, would be, yes, I think I'll take it. And maybe they just needed that space.
Yeah.
It's a very, very good point. But as you say, a lot of people want to fill that space, the nerves. Yeah, they can't bear it. Oh. They can't bear it. Very true. Very true. So tell me, so as I said, in your very long and varied career, what have been some of the more instructive setbacks, or as I said to some people, what have been some of your best mistakes, your most valuable mistakes?
Definitely the first one that comes to mind was a business failure when I left Australia 4.5 years ago, which I won't go into the details of it because it's still raw, 4.5 years ago. But to cut a long story short, I put too much naive trust in a business partner, and it all collapsed. And it's easy to blame others, but I think we all have our own accountability. And what that has done is, since then, I've never put my own money into businesses unless I've been completely and utterly convinced. And I've also created a kind of a 3-gate test now for me before I collaborate with anybody in any form, right? And I don't know whether I mentioned this to you before, but before I do, I need to like them or feel that I like them, right? It's very hard to define these things. It's kind of a mix of gut feeling and head and heart. So do I feel like I like this person, right? And do I do I respect them? And that's easier. I mean, just look at the LinkedIn profile. Do they have credibility? Is there anything negative about them? What are other people saying? So that's easy. And then the third part is, do I feel like I trust them? Right. And that's harder again, because that's very subjective and it's very much a gut feeling. And it's kind of slightly informed by the respect one as well, because obviously if they got great credibility and somebody like Marshall Goldsmith endorses them, whatever, then it's easier to do that. So I forced myself to operate through that. It sounds very artificial, but I try and use that 3-pronged self-analysis of when I will look to collaborate. And coincidentally, maybe it's not coincidentally, I haven't had a business failure since. I haven't actually fallen out with anybody since creating that. And so that's kind of just an exercise in self-awareness, I think. Self-awareness, self-management, as I said, relationship management, and situational awareness, the 4 areas, I think, really, which feed into emotional intelligence. So I think at the old cliche, you learn best from failures, that actually applied to me.
Yeah, as Benjamin Franklin said, pain instructs. I think he was probably right. On the flip side of what you're saying, I'm just wondering, what are some of your red flags? What are some of the little pointers toward that, maybe not that there are bad people or anything, but maybe they're just not a great fit for you, or there's something a bit off about an organization or a potential business partnership of some description?
Yeah, that's a harder one, right? So, I'm looking for those red flags, and it's very hard to put your finger on them. But there are things like, in a conversation, is this person or organization, if it's an organization, do I really feel like they're listening to me? Are they really listening? Are they really showing an interest, or is this one of a number of conversations they're going through, right? So it's that, how are they really, really listening? Not just hearing, but listening. I guess that would be one. I also look for body language, this kind of stuff. It's around the human connection side of things. It's not just, for me, communication isn't just the words, isn't just the message. It's that feeling of connection, right? And so I allow myself to feel, is this person really involved in this conversation, or do I feel this is another box tick for them? And box tick is fine, right? So it's very hard to define. This is a great question, Al. Maybe this is another book. What is it about? It's very easy to talk about, as I said, the three great. It's very easy to talk about the things that you put barriers up to, but to talk about the things that invite you in or others into your psyche, that's a complicated one. It's very subjective. I do think connection is a subjective thing. There are people, unfortunately, who don't like you. There are some people you just connect with. If anybody came up with an algorithm that defined that would be priceless.
Most definitely. It's are you working on another book at the moment, or is it not just yet?
No, I've got a couple of books, but not one involving this.
Yeah. Excellent. Just on a slightly different note, I know one of your more recent projects is all around inclusion and leadership. And it's a very interesting area. In some ways, it's a hot topic. It's certainly a lot of attention all across society. Tell us why you're interested in working with inclusion and leadership. And again, what's your take on that and how you do it a little bit differently to maybe other organizations? So
there's two drivers for me personally, and you've met one of my co-partners in the business inclusion and leadership, Elizabeth Suarez. Two drivers. First is personal, right? So I lived in Australia for 10 years, and I spent nearly 6 of that working in the Aboriginal or Indigenous economic development space. For BHP, I was a CEO for the world's largest Indigenous-run business from Alaska in Australia, NANA Australia, which stands for Northwest Arctic Native Association Australia. And the role of that company was to create collaboration agreements with Australian Indigenous businesses. And then thirdly, I was head of the Indigenous Tourism Council for Australia as a consultant. And so I had a deep, here was a white Anglo-Irish, Polish guy from Europe living in Australia, working with the Australian Indigenous Tourism Council and Alaskan Indigenous business in Australia, working with Aboriginal people around the world. And it really opened my eyes on a very, very deep level as to how privileged you and I are just because of the way we look, right? Mm-hmm. And where we come from. And so that will never leave me, Al, that spiritual connection, particularly to Indigenous people around the world. Secondly, it's the more mundane but very pragmatic driver. I spend some of my time representing a London-based company called Brand Finance, which is the world's largest brand valuation agency. And they put values on corporate brands. And it's increasingly being demonstrated through some of their work that those companies who really put inclusion and cohesion and the various methodologies at the core of their strategy not only improve their productivity, they also improve their profitability and their brand value, and also shareholder returns. So there's an emotional aspect, and then there is a business imperative. So we've created this entity, and for me, it's just common sense, right? So A, you're doing the right thing to people, and B, if you do this the right way, and we can talk about our methodology, you can also improve your business. So the challenge, though, Al, is that, and what we're doing is talking to C-suites, right? The challenge is A, most of them don't even know this is an issue, right?
Right.
B, if they did, do they care? I don't know. And even if they did care, so there's three gates, are they really going to get their hands dirty? They're just going to say, talk to HR. So the challenge is to persuade the decision makers that this is not only good from a brand perspective, this is also good from a financial perspective.
Okay, so it's very tied in with the ROI.
Yep.
It's very tied in as we talked about before, where, you have to be able to justify to the psychopath in the room, the cold hard numbers, right? Yeah. But that's what I find fascinating about this, is that it does justify on all of those levels across the board, right? Doesn't it?
It does. And anybody can Google. There's a report by Brand Finance. If anybody Googles diversity in corporations, Brand Finance, they've done the work. They've done the analysis, right? And it's proven that those brands who invest in their reputation, particularly in down times, have a better time from a growth and also stock market perspective. It's been proven. I just guess it goes back to, we've been running business the way we've been running business for hundreds of years, and it's persuading the powers who be that maybe we should start looking at things slightly differently. And I do think it is changing. The most successful companies in the world are those which make their entire team feel like they're critical and integral, right? And I'm not going to rattle off examples, but there are examples, and I've worked for one in the tech industry. But this requires a culture of accomplishment and sharing in the ups and downs, right? This needs honest leadership, right? A corporate culture is really cemented by when the whole company feels like it has purpose. And it's very easy, and there's thousands of consultants like you and I using these words every day. But I think the difference that we're bringing is, and without going into too much detail, we're hoping to cement a relationship with a technology company, with a software that actually measures this stuff. I haven't mentioned that to you before, but I'm not going to mention any names right now. The difference is we can actually prove this, right? As long as companies do things the right way. And we can talk about those.
I mean, that's huge as well, that, as you said, I remember we did talk about this, and that there is a metric or a series of metrics coming in to actually measure the progress, starting point of various milestones, and then when you're finished working with them, and the improvements, which is quite remarkable. So you will prove that inclusion works. I mean, for me, it makes perfect sense that it's utilizing, again, thinking of it in a cold, hard way, you're utilizing the resources that you have.
Yep.
Otherwise, it's waste. What are you doing?
Absolutely. And there's a good example in Australia when I was there. I think they had some of the 3 or 4 biggest consulting companies doing an analysis of if you spent certain money on indigenous economic development, Aboriginal economic development in Australia, I think it was 8 billion Aussie dollars. Most people, the naysayers, said that's a waste of $8 billion. But the analysis, I think it was Deloitte's came out with, the analysis was that would actually improve the overall GDP of Australia by a net additional $16 billion. And it's the same with companies, but you need to be open-minded. And it comes back to leadership, right? So none of this works without leadership brought in. And, a leader doesn't just represent an organization, i.e. being the face of the brand. He or she also inspires, or should inspire and motivate, an organization through challenges and opportunities. It's the leader who sets the tone, right? And leadership's a key influence on maintaining and developing the culture. So even though we have an irresistible process and a way of measuring this stuff, the leaders still need to believe this and then really pass this through.
Mm-hmm. I mean, are they coming around? I would imagine they are, but is it still a bit of a battle?
Well, I mean, it's early days. We've only launched the business in the last month, but we've landed a university in the UK, and so Southampton University. So and they're their program is in association with JP Morgan, one of the world's biggest banks, and there's real interest there. As I said, we're just about to sign this deal with a tech company, provide measurement, and in the States, and it's interesting. So you mentioned, are they coming around? There are different ways. The world is looking at this in different ways. So in the States, really the focus is on traditional diversity and inclusion for obvious reasons. In 2020, the world changed with the pandemic, and race riots and all this sort of stuff, a lot of it out of the States, okay? But over here in Europe, I guess we're looking more around, in Ireland, because of all the tech companies here and multinationals, the conversation is around, well, how do we maintain a culturally cohesive workforce or gender balance? So there are 5 aspects, which I'll go into. So the 5 columns that organizations or leaders need to believe in to drive, and then we can measure and then provide an assessment and an ongoing process. The first one is, do you have the right diversity, equity, inclusion processes and policies in place? Second one is gender balance. The third one is cultural cohesion. The fourth one is, do you have the right ethical win-win communication structures? And the last one then is how do you ensure that remote cohesive workforces are really inclusive, right? And which includes knowledge management, includes how is that retained within an organization? How do you inspire and mentor younger workers, right, when they're not in the office? So this is complicated stuff and it's very broad, but if organizations do this the right way, we can measure it and you'll see the results and the effect on productivity, profitability, and brand value.
It sounds
you just need to believe this stuff.
Sounds very comprehensive. As I said, you're already talking about how to manage and get the most out of and feel that they're part of something bigger when they're working remotely. I mean, this is, as I said, it's more comprehensive than what many people would expect. Yeah.
And I think that's important because, and there's no coincidence that we've called ourselves inclusion in leadership, right? So what we're talking about there is inclusion from top down. So we're all part of this, right? And also from left to right way from diversity, equity, inclusion, right through cultural cohesion, right through how we, remote workers are managed, right? Or empowered. The seeds of a corporate culture are sown from day one, and a successful organization and culture ensures that all employees are satisfactorily motivated and engaged, right? That's really what inclusion is about. It's about satisfactory motivation and engagement. It's then up to each individual to drive their own pathway. So what we're really talking about is how do we ensure inclusion and cohesion at the starting gate? That's what we're talking about. Most organizations aren't even thinking about the starting gate. Then it's up to individuals to find their own pathway. You still need to have structures through that process, but that's a key part.
It's fascinating stuff, particularly, as you say, when you are starting from the leadership, because that's often where the culture drips down from.
Yeah.
I remember saying to a friend of mine many years ago, and most of my experience was in smaller businesses, and I noted that small businesses are a direct reflection of the mind of the founder.
Yeah.
And their point was they worked in a huge corporation and said, it's actually surprisingly similar in these very large companies.
It is.
So with that in mind, do you have any kind of quick, because you're great for taking complexity and taking to the principle, if you will, which is simple but not overly simple. Do you have any quick acid tests as to whether a company is on the right track with their inclusion?
It depends on which of those 5 channels you're talking about. So there are different factors demonstrating progress, right? So for example, let's just take one, which is, the remote cohesive workforce, right? So some of the things we look at are, companies need to proactively develop nurturing virtual teamwork environments, right? So the first thing is, are there online safe spaces for communication, right? As safe as you can be for communication, right? Number 2, is particular sensitivity, this is really important, shown to employees operating in field or remote locations? Because often, I don't know about you, but when I've worked for big multinationals, there's been an us and them attitude. So people in the headquarters assume that people in field offices aren't pulling their weight, right? And people in field offices, I've worked for multinationals, I've worked in both HQ and the field office, assume that people in HQ are aloof, right? Or excluding them. So there needs to be a culture of sharing. There needs to be a culture of ensuring that there is, particular sensitivity both ways. Scheduling regular meetings, right? And I guess over communicating, honestly, is really important. Over communicating. So that just gives you a flavor of some of the processes that we look at. Obviously, I can't get into the detail of it, but this stuff's important because it's very nuanced. But at the end of the day, Al, most of this stuff that comes down to human beings, it comes down to communication, right? Which is the outward reflection of inner awareness. If an organization's aware or senses there's breakdown, why don't they just deal with this stuff rather than just brushing it aside? So all we're doing is we're just, I guess, extracting the bee sting or the wasp sting and saying, right, take the sting out, then just deal with this stuff, demystifying it and deal with it rather than just allowing it to fester.
It's a very good point. And going back to a point you just made there, it reminds me of that phrase, I'm not sure if it was Shaw or who said it, but was the greatest problem with communication is thinking it happened. Where often someone, if you ask them, he said, oh, of course, I told them everything. I told them that, they're welcome to X, Y, and Z, and they're very, I'm feeling very inclusive, but it's how the message is received that is as important.
And I had a great, an example of that has, I guess, motivated me in all this. When I started work for BHP, the world's biggest mining company in Australia, 13 years ago, my job was to help develop indigenous subcontractors. These are mining, earthworks, civil engineering companies, some of them as big as $350 million Australian dollar turnover, significant companies. And I had a year to come up with a process, and I came up with a process that demarcated indigenous economic development, employment, and education, right? And what came out of this whole process was, and we improved KPIs by 72% in a year, right? So we improved the number of indigenous contractors who received contracts and also the revenue they got out of it. And I spent a whole year. We had Bain Consulting, we had Boston Consulting, we had PwC represent each of those three limbs. So BHP threw a lot of money out of this. And there were thousands of reasons why there was communication breakdown between Aboriginal contractors and essentially white heads of supply and procurement who were managing billion-dollar contracts. Think obvious things like racism, ignorance, perceptions on the white side, and on the indigenous side, similar, but in return. And by breaking down a lot of that stuff and just getting past those assumptions and actually getting Aboriginal elders to talk to predominantly white heads of procurement, bang, we saw the results, right? So you can't, if you just keep assuming this stuff, and that's what drives inclusion in leadership, it will keep happening. If you shine a light on it and for want of a better expression, bash heads together, get people to talk, guaranteed you'll see improvement. How much improvement depends on the organization, and critically, you need to measure it. So that's really driving. I guess you can hear that time in Australia really underpinned a lot of this stuff for me.
Absolutely. I imagine there's a huge amount of stories there.
Yeah.
Particularly in that conflict resolution side, because you are a coach and a negotiator, but you're a trained mediator as well.
Yeah.
Was there a lot of mediation work in that field?
Yeah, there was, and I mean, I didn't use it from a professional perspective, but again, it was really around the whole areas of awareness, and just providing a safe environment for thinking stuff through, right? And allowing people to realize that yes, we all have biases, right? And yes, stereotypes exist, right? Of course they do, right? All of us have biases. All of us have stereotypes, and that's fine. And they're shorthands for various different things, but always scratch under the surface and treat every single human being as an individual, right? And, for example, I do a lot of work around negotiation, as you do, and there's a chart that shows, those cultures that are very emotionally expressive on the left and very emotionally unexpressive on the right, and very combative at the top from a negotiation perspective, and very, very passive at the bottom. And traditionally, the Israeli culture would be top left, very expressive, very combative. and Japanese bottom right, completely opposite. But I've done work with very outgoing, loud, bombastic Japanese people, and I've done work with not so many, quieter, reserved, inscrutable Israeli people. So you have to get people together and realize that, yes, these are shorthand signals, but it's all about who you're dealing with. And that was a big, so, I'm not a trained psychologist, but it's all around that interaction. It's that trust, it's that communication, it's that empathy thing.
It's very interesting because I often talk to clients about trying to dig up some of those assumptions, but moving from assumption to hypothesis.
Yeah.
So the difference being a hypothesis, you hold right here and you're constantly updating it with new information, whereas an assumption has that false certainty in it.
Yeah.
Very dangerous. Yeah, absolutely.
Very dangerous. Very dangerous.
In regards to deal making, making agreements. So deal making, making agreements, there's two Venn diagram bubbles that has obvious overlap, but can be radically separate as well. What advice would you give some people in how to maybe start looking at how they make agreements? So sometimes, as you said, they can be for large contracts or whatever, but even just within their team. So this is maybe where the having people feel included and act included, and making agreements. Yeah. Where are just some of those? We talked about some of the earlier mistakes, but what might be some of your advice on that, maybe?
There's lots of different ways to answer this, but maybe
it's you could answer it in 40 different ways. So sorry.
Yeah, maybe a convenient way is I talk about 3 forms of assessment, right? So whenever you go into a negotiation or an agreement phase or in any aspect of navigating life, right? There's 3 aspects of assessment, right? So the first one is self-assessment, then it's situational assessment, then it's assessing the other side, right? So there's a practical component, there's an objective, and there's a subjective part of this. So, if you said to me, right, Simon, I want you and I to start a process around agreeing on something, right? I'd start by saying, right, let's do an assessment of me, right? Why would I say yes to this process? How do I feel about this process? What's my motivation? What's my intent, right? What do I want to get out of this, right? So I'd be looking at that stuff. Now, of course, you don't do this in the heat of the moment. You need time. And then I would look at you. I'd say, right, so why is Al really asking me to do this? Why do I think, what's his intent, right? All those kind of things. And then I'd look at impartially the situation, right? So, is there a good reason for this? Aside from what Al is talking about, aside from what I think, is there an objective good rationale for this? So I try and break it down, and I find that it puts a bit of metric and a bit of discipline around that process. And so I talk a lot about that in some of the work I do, and I think it's useful to do that because it's about the self-awareness and the situational awareness. And I think it's often about the intent, right? What's my intent for this? And what do I think your intent is? And the only way you're going to find out is by asking. It's communication, right? I think it's Tony Robbins says, better negotiators or deal makers ask better questions, right? They don't just ask questions, they ask better questions. So the only way that I'm going to find out your intent is by asking you questions, right? And then stopping and listening and allowing that silence occasionally. So I think breaking it down to those 3 components, those 3 types of assessment areas, I think that's really important.
Very interesting. Yeah, I have a similar approach. And one of the things that always amazes me on that line is how little preparation negotiators often do in the thinking, or as you said, the intent of the other side. It's often very detailed business arguments of what they're instructed to do and such, but very little on the psychological intent and where they're coming from.
It's funny you should say that because, as you know, I'm a trained lawyer. I spent 13 years as a lawyer in Ireland, England, Wales, and Australia. I wrote a book on contract law 21 years ago. Thankfully, I got out of the legal profession because it was like a straitjacket for me to an extent. I'm very creative and I like people and I like the thought process around growth, right? So a lot of lawyers would dispute the relevance or the veracity or the importance of what you and I are talking about. They would say it's really about, it's the fifth P in my 5-7P process. It's just about performance. So when I 4 years ago, I was talking to law firms and legal, the Law Society in the UK, in England and Wales, which is a client, and I was telling them about the process. There was almost a response of, well, this is all a bit waffly and fluffy. Deals are just about the document. They're just about the law. And eventually I managed to persuade the Law Society of England and Wales, they're a client of mine, that this is not, that's just one. If you can visualize a sliced loaf of bread, right? And a deal making journey from beginning to end. So beginning is having the right business development team. Then it's, putting the right tenders out. Then it's when you get the responses, how do you deal with them? Assuming the deal lands on the table, do you have the right people? How do they process this? It's only about slice 22 do you land at the performance, right? Mm-hmm. And even then at the performance, then you've got to have cross the T's, dot the I's. Then you've still got to have a deal review team. So the legal part, I'm afraid to say to the lawyers out there, is only one of about 30 slices.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I find the same working with particularly the old professions. Substance only, or, their substance of their argument only is worth a tiny percentage of a successful deal. People is worth usually 55%. So it goes meta studies. Yeah. So it's what we were talking about at the start. It is the know, like, and trust.
Yeah.
Because if they don't have one of those, or respect, then they're not even going to really hear what your substance actually is, because they're going, I don't care, I hate you so much, I'm just going to even take a lose-lose, which is in a lot of legal cases a very big reality.
Exactly.
So as you said, that you need some of that people element.
Yeah, I agree.
Very, very interesting stuff. So thank you very much for your time today, Simon. It's been a fascinating conversation. Now, if people want to learn more about you, about your multitude of different projects you have on, or more specifically the inclusion in leadership, where can they go?
So as you said, there's various channels, but I guess I'm very active on LinkedIn. So Simon Haigh, Haigh on LinkedIn, or my website, simonhaigh.com, all one word, simonhaigh.com. In terms of inclusion in leadership, it's inclusion in leadership, all one word.com. I think there would be the three main areas. So through the website, my website, inclusioninleadership.com, or on LinkedIn. I'm a bit addicted to LinkedIn. I'm on there all day long. So feel free to connect.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon.
You're welcome. It was great chatting. Thanks.
Cheers.